Good evening, everyone. My name is Nikhil Sinha, I'm Vice Chancellor of the Shiv Nadar University. Welcome to the fifth of the SNU-IIC lecture series. The purpose of the SNU-IIC lecture series has been to bring to the forefront some of the major policy issues being faced by the country today, to have some of the most wise, informed and knowledgeable people come and speak to us on those subjects, and then to engage in a debate and a conversation on some of these issues. The lectures series is called India and the World, and we hope that a lot of what we discuss in these lectures are also informed by the global context as well. We have today, I think, a very, very interesting topic, which is trends in education and inequality, to be delivered today by Surjit Bhalla. I know that he is well known to almost everybody in this audience, but just by way of background, Surjit has a PhD from Princeton and is the Senior Indian Analyst for the Observatory Group and Chairman and Managing Director of Oxus Investments. He is taught far and wide, including the Delhi School of Economics. He's worked at RAND, he's worked at the Brookings Institution, as well as with Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank. He's on the governing board of India's largest think tank, the NCAER. And of course, he is a terrific columnist, and I'm sure many of you have had the opportunity to read his writings in the popular press. Perhaps most importantly of all, though, he's authored a book on cricket titled Between the Wickets, the Who and Why of the Best in Cricket. Welcome, Sujit. Chairing the session today is again another very eminent person, Arun Maira. He is currently Chancellor of the Central University of Himachal Pradesh, but I'm sure many of you know him or of him as a former member of the Planning Commission. He's also former chairman of the Boston Consulting Group and former chairman of Save the Children India. With that, I hand it over to you, Arun.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So good evening and welcome everyone to what I know is going to be a feast of thought. The subject that Surjit is going to talk about is trends in education and trends in inequality. Education is a multifaceted phenomena, a field, and inequality is a multidimensional phenomena. To see threads in these, trends in these, and to perhaps connect those trends is a task that I wouldn't attempt. But knowing Surjit well, as many of you who read his column would know him, as he says, no proof required. He's just going to state it, and we're going to get it and get educated ourselves this evening. We'll realize, of course, in the process about the inequality between our minds, Surjit, yours and mine, as you say. So we've agreed, Surjit and I, that it is going to be a debate, actually, but at the end. First, Surjit is going to be, and that's what we're looking forward to, talk to us about the trends in inequality and education that he sees and that he thinks we should, must make note of. And then there'll be time for a discussion with Surjit, and hopefully some of those discussions might be mutually provocative to make it a more illuminating evening. So with that, Surjit, may I request you to, I'm going to move around, but I'd like to also take notes. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arun, and thank you very much, Shiv Nadar. What do I do? There. Thanks for inviting me for this. And the subject matter is inequality. And also when I say education, both trends in the levels of education and in inequality in education. Very clearly, inequality has been an outstanding subject for investigation, for debate, and for ideology for more than 100 years, perhaps 150, 160 years, and still continuing strong. And I want to reflect on this with some numbers, with some facts, so that proof is required in order to see what's happening. You know, the conclusion is going to be, and as it comes out very clearly in the title, the increasing importance of education for declining inequality. Whereas most of our conversations, excuse me, most of our policies are about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. If you've heard it once, you've heard it 1,000 times, especially in India. And I want to look at the political economy of this very elitist concept, if you will, about increasing inequality. Okay, you know, the subject, if you will, goes back to, on an empirical basis, to the Kuznets curve. The belief that inequality will worsen was first propagated by Simon Kuznets, who's a Nobel Prize winner, and all it says is that, and he observed, and this was somewhere in the early 1960s, and he looked at the world, and looked at the developing countries, and looked at the developed, excuse me, developed countries, and came up with the observation that as a society develops, as incomes per capita rise, inequality will rise, and then after peaking out somewhere, it'll come down to where, if you will, the developed countries are, which is around here, which is possibly where the developing countries start off from here. So this is the inverted U-curve hypothesis. Now, what's the reasoning behind this? And he had a very good, so he had observations on developed countries, which were all clustered around here, which were, if you will, the Gini level of approximately 0.3, 0.35. And then he had, if you will, developing countries all clustered, if you will, somewhere here, which was around 35, 40. But there were countries like Brazil, etc., which had much higher inequality, which were also at a higher standard of living than compared to the very poor countries, which is India and China and the rest of them. Now, why would you get inequality to rise? And the reasoning was very straightforward, very empirical. And he observed that, listen, basically the development process is a transformation from agriculture to industry. As labor moves from agriculture, low productivity jobs, to high productivity jobs or higher productivity jobs in industry, their wages go up. And since the fractions of people in the low productivity jobs in agriculture, etc., are 60, 70, 80%, and the fractions of people in the high productivity jobs in the urban areas are about 20%. So it's absolutely, you know, a given that as people moved from agriculture to industry, as the fractions in industry rise, as the fractions in agriculture go down, that you will have inequality rising. It's absolutely a given. And he came up with this, and if you will, all of us believed it. Every, if you will, economist, every development economist, when I went to graduate school in the early 70s, this was an absolute given. Now, what has happened to inequality? So let's look at, I'll look at it in detail about India, but there will be time later on when I'll also talk about what's happened in China. But basically what has happened in India is broadly reflective, perhaps more than broadly reflective, of what's happened in the rest of the world, in the rest of the developing world. So what has happened in India to inequality over the last 30 years? And what we see is that basically these are Gini coefficients, okay, from 1983. And I've given for both nominal consumption, this is all based on NSS data, on both nominal consumption, which doesn't take into account the fact that some of your richness comes out from higher prices. So, and the real one, which is the blue line, is in real terms. And therefore, this thing was somewhere around 0.31, 0.32. 93, which, if you will, the ideological, those who are prone to ideology love picking on the fact that in 93 we had the lowest inequality ever measured, and that's what the data shows. But you know, the difference between this and this is not that high, okay? And I'll show you some other data which also suggests not that high. And now what you have is this is 0.33, and this is 0.31, and that is 0.34. Much ado about nothing, right? I mean, basically it's constant. When, if you go back to the previous graph, inequality was supposed to rise from something like a Gini of 0.3 to a Gini of 0.5 or 0.6 before declining. So what has happened? Why? I mean, India is the most classic case of development, of, if you will, transformation from agriculture to industry. In India's case, it's a bit more from transformation from agriculture to services, but nevertheless, the services jobs are higher productivity jobs than agriculture. So it comes to the same thing. So what is making this happen? Now, what is making this happen is the following. Back in the early 60s, when Kuznets wrote about the Kuznets curve, the belief was, the profound belief, if you will, in a more rigorous fashion amongst economists, was the belief that it pertains to experts in sociology, which is your income is not a function of education. Income is not a function of education. Income is a function of your contacts, what kind of occupation you are in, all the rest of what sex you are, all kinds of other determinants than education. Around the same time when Kuznets wrote his thesis, there was another Nobel Prize winner by the name of Gary Becker. And Gary Becker postulated that, listen, the major determinant of individual's income was the amount of education, the amount of human capital the individual had. You know, it is amazing that prior to Gary Becker in 1959, 1960, you look at whichever economist you want to think about, and these were very powerful and brilliant economists, income did not enter, education did not enter into the equation for, education did not enter into the equation for determining a person's income. We now take it for granted. All of you students, etc., take it for granted. Your parents take it for granted. And I don't know a single person in the world who does not take it for granted that getting higher education, more education, helps increase your income. It's a self-evident truth, just like it was a self-evident truth 50 years ago that basically education had nothing to do with your income. So this is, if you will, the beginning of the great connection between education and income. So what we see in India is the constant inequality for the last 30 years and a sharp rise in the years of education, that individuals have. And here we now have a Gini, exactly the same thing as the Gini, if you will. Gini, for those of you who are not familiar, basically means that the value of Gini is 1 or 100 if one person has all the education in the economy or all the income in the economy, and 0 if everybody has the same education, analogously the same income in the economy. So that is just a measure of inequality which has very nice properties, if you will. But here I want to show you it doesn't matter. You know, basically one of the themes in any seminar is, but not so in rural India, but not so amongst women, but not so amongst this, but not so amongst that. Here, you pick what you want. You want all India, you want rural, you want urban, you want female, you want male, it doesn't matter. the education inequality, if you will, has been trending sharply down, not just down, and sharply down. And what's the magnitude? It's about 40% between 1983, when the Gini was about 0.7, to now, 2011-12, when the Gini is about 0.45. For those of you familiar with the literature on inequality, this is like a black swan event. And the point is, this black swan event is happening in every country in the world. And there's a very logical reason why inequality will inevitably decline. Let me underline that. Will inevitably decline, and decline by large margins. And the reason is as follows. In the beginning, right, there are about 5%, I'll give you some numbers later on, there are about 5% of the people who, and let's call them for ease of communication, the upper class twits, right? The upper class twits had 16 years of education, and their kids will have 16 years of education, right? Stands to reason. Now, some stray guy or gal will go ahead and get 18 years of education, 19, but on average, the upper class will get 16 years of education. They can't move from there. What's happening to the rest of the population, the bottom 95%, which becomes the bottom 90%, which becomes the bottom 85%? They start going to school. Now, I'm not talking about quality over here, but it doesn't matter. The quality, the quantity effect, if you will, completely swamps the individual quality effect. What's happening is that basically mean years of education go up through time, whereas these guys are stuck over here at 16. Think of it, are stuck with $1 million worth of income, right? So they have $1 million or $1 million rupees or whatever your criteria is. And the other guys start with 10, goes to 100, goes to 200. So you can see that inequality is steadily declining, inevitably declining, and will continue to decline until, if you will, everybody's got the same education. And that's when ability will take over, because your ability will now determine to a much larger extent your level of income, rather than the amount of education or the amount of human capital you have, which also includes years of experience, etc. So now let's look at, what I'll look at is what's happening to inequality. And this is, will turn out to be all kinds of, if you will, good news on the inequality front, and therefore good news elsewhere. This one looks at the education inequality, excuse me, the relative, another measure of inequality. And this measure has the relative education, the mean years of education of women to the mean years of education for men. And what you find is, amongst the youth, and the youth are defined as 15 to 24 years of age. So back in 1983, amongst all groups, so let's take this one, that an average woman had only about 65% of the education of an average man. And it turns out that an average woman in 1983, a working woman, got, if you will, amongst the youth, so when I say an average young woman, had 2/3 of the education of an average young man. And there were lots of papers, and I'm sure you can go to EPW and find tons of them, as to how the market was discriminating against women. This is the whole story about the women have a lower wage because the market is discriminating against them. Well, there's another story. There is a discrimination against women, but that discrimination was at home. It wasn't the market giving the women a lower wage. It was the parents educating their sons much more than their daughters. So therefore, the women, when they went out in the marketplace, got a lower wage. And interestingly enough, exactly equal to the proportion of their education. It so happens there isn't a necessary, so they had 2/3 of the education of young men and 2/3 of the incomes of young men. Now let's look at what has happened to the mean years of education of young women to young men urban areas of India. And the reason I've chosen urban areas, one, the results are very striking. The same phenomena is happening in the rural areas, but not to the same degree. But I think this is accelerating. And what you get is the mean years of education of a woman was 6 years and 7.5 years for man. What is it in 2011-12? It's equal. In 2011-12, which is 4 years ago, the average education, and I'm not, as I said, not controlling for quality, though all the data that comes out is that the women are scoring higher than men according to every test that you can administer. And presumably the same happens at Shiv Nadar University. If it doesn't happen at Shiv Nadar University, then we have to start looking at the data. But the point being, they're having the same years of education, and as it turns out, I don't have that graph over here, in terms of their wages. Now this is of the wages of the women who enter the marketplace, young women 15 to 24, are now 3% higher than the wages of young men in urban areas of India in 2011-12. So now I guess we'll have to have a reverse theory of discrimination. But be that as it may, the fact remains this is a huge, huge revolution whose consequences are yet to emerge in terms of what will happen to inequality. Because the women are now, the young women, if you will, the labor force participation rate, young and old, is quite low in India and is one of the lowest in the world, and certainly the lowest outside of the Arab-speaking world, at only about 30-32%. Now who's working? Apart from the rural areas where everybody works, in the urban areas, it is basically the upper class women who are working, and the emerging middle class, etc., withdraws from the labor force once they have a certain amount of income or the family has a certain amount of income. The point being that as India develops more and more, that basically these women, which also come from, as I said, not from the upper class, but from the remaining class, their incomes will go up. Their family income, their per capita income will go up. And this will further add to a declining inequality in the entire economy. And this is the same thing about relative female to male education. It's the same graph coming out a little bit differently. Now, before I get to that, let me come up with 2 or 3 other observations on education in India and how it has proceeded. So just for a recap, basically education in India has advanced fairly rapidly, and if you will, the rate of change is proportional, is amongst the highest in the world. The level, which I'll talk about in a minute, is still not very high of the overall education system. And here I'll go into some of the reasons why this may not be the case. Remember that basically at the time of independence, and here I want to cite you some data for both India and China. In 1950, illiteracy in China was 72%, illiteracy in India was 82%. Okay? And this is a graph that shows the illiteracy in India, 82%, illiteracy in China, 72%. What about in 1980? China had gone all the way from 72 to 35, a huge increase in educational levels. Illiteracy was cut in half in 30 years. What happened to India? Illiteracy went down from 82 to 61%, a much, much smaller decline. What was happening? What was happening was that we had, our leadership believed in the following, believed in the temples of wisdom, believed in education for the upper class. The very same people who will have their education no matter what in every society in the world, the upper class goes ahead and gets its education. But no, we had and this is where Nehru comes in. It was his vision. You want to call it socialist, you want to call it secular, you call it what you will. We followed one of the most disastrous education policies known to man, woman, or any developing country. And that disastrous education policy was to feed the elites. And look at what has happened, what happened to the percentage of people in higher education in China. In China, it went up from 0.5 to 1.3. We were below China in 1950, about the fraction of population that was in college. In 1980, the temples of wisdom, this will make India grow faster, etc., will have 2.4 years of education. Further, and how many of you have gone to universities in India, especially now it has turned out the private universities have come about, but you take the leading universities in India and our leading politicians, the fees that you pay in Delhi University, in JNU, I hope there are some students here from JNU, I doubt it, but nevertheless, pay a pitiful amount for education. Now, who are these people? These very same people who are at Delhi University, who are at JNU, who are at any university in India, paid an enormous amount in the high school and the grade school education. Enormous amount. Right? And then they come to college. These are the kids who are the most qualified, whose parents are rich. And yet we cannot change our education system in India to get the upper class twits to pay for the education. There is no other, maybe Egypt actually, maybe there are a couple of other countries that are in the same bag that we are. But this is outlandish. This is just plain elitism to the nth degree, that the rich people don't pay for university education. The poor people don't have much of a chance to get into a good university because they didn't go to good schools. They didn't go to the good schools because we were building temples of wisdom over here. This is back in 1980. So we were feeding the elite, and we continue to feed the elite. And this is where I think where we need some discussion about the facts about who is benefiting and why, because as you've seen, education is a major instrument by which we can have lower inequality, by which everybody is better off, the rich get not so rich and the poor get better off, and all the rest of it. But we did not pursue it. We are still not pursuing it because the elite has captured, if you will, a major benefit. And these are the same guys who will come out and say, oh, you know, we need to increase the tax rate on the rich, etc. The rich get all the benefits, when the biggest amount of benefit are these very same people. They will not advocate that the university system be converted, transformed into an ability to pay system. If you have met one such individual, I'd like to know. I'd like to get in touch with this individual. But this is the irony in India, that we keep talking about secularism and socialism in particular. We have it in our constitution, when we are the most rapidly socialist economy in the world, because socialism means you feed the rich, you feed the elite. That is Indian socialism. Now, I want to show you this graph. As I pointed out before, that basically education income, education inequality will decline over time. And what this graph shows, and I'll come to Piketty in a minute, what this graph shows is that in 1850, the world Gini, world inequality, was at something like 55. In the mid-70s or the late 70s, world inequality went up to 72, 73. And today, it is back to the level it was in 1875 and fast on its way to a level of 1850. Now, why is this happening? There's a very easy, I get tired of listening to all this debate on inequality and all the rest of it, especially in the world or in India, as I've pointed out earlier. Why is this happening? Very simple again. You know, these things have the simplest possible explanation that you can think of, and yet we will have scholars completely ignoring this. And what is the simplest possible explanation? Take 1980. From 1980 to 2010, 2015, if you will, 40% of the world, that is India and China, has been growing at an average rate, and more China than India, but I'm taking an India-China population of 40%, growing at an average rate of something like 7% per capita per year. So these are the very poor people whose growth of income is 7% per year. Then the very rich people, and you can include whichever you want, all of Western Europe, all of Japan, all of OECD, you take whatever you want. They're growing at 1%, 2% a year per capita, if at all. And the average, I think, is somewhere close to 1.5%, 2%. So therefore, the poor countries are making up. That is why the inequality, if you will, starts this. Look at this. Never before in the history of the world have you seen either this rapid a decline or this rapid an increase. This slope is much slower than this slope. This is, you know, why isn't this a cause for celebration about how the world inequality, if you will, is improving in a radical fashion, not in a simple fashion, in a radical fashion. But what we have is Mr. Piketty and his followers who are claiming that, listen, the world is becoming more and more unequal. Now, to be accurate, he breaks it up into the world in the developed world and the developing world. And in the developed world, it turns out that all of 3 countries, US, Great Britain, and Australia, are showing declining equality or increasing inequality. And he also claims, and this was a paper he authored with Abhijit Banerjee, published in the late, I think published sometimes in 2004, 2005, where he looked at the tax data, and there's a lot of hard work that goes into looking at and collecting the data on taxes that individuals pay. But the entire Piketty World Income Database, top income database, is based on taxes. Now, what happens? In developing countries, especially countries like India, and he finds that inequality goes up, though actually, as I'll just show you over here, it doesn't go up. It doesn't even go up as much as consumption inequality in India. But what he finds is that, listen, that inequality of the top 1% or 0.01% have a higher share of income than before. And that indeed may be the case. But what is relevant is who are these people. If they're taking higher income share, they're taking it from somebody. And it turns out they're taking it from the 96th percentile to the 99th percentile. They're not taking it from the rest of us, number one. Number two, if you're basing it on tax data has compliance in it. So on the one hand, we're all advocating, and only 50% of Indians who should pay taxes actually do pay taxes. We all complain as to the fact that the rich people are not paying their taxes. It turns out it is the middle income people who don't really pay taxes, your doctors, your lawyers, your dentists, your professionals, your shopkeepers, etc. These are the guys who, lawyers, I think I mentioned, yeah, who don't pay taxes or don't pay taxes commensurate with their income because there's a lot of income that is hidden away. But what you will get, regardless of whether who are the bad guys, who are the good guys, what you will get is over time, inequality will go up a little bit and then will show the same as more and more people comply. If you have tax data, you will get inequality coming down because more and more people are entering the tax net. So let's see what's the story in India. The red is your NSS, your NSS data. Okay? So what it shows that in and Piketty's data only goes up to 1999. Piketty-Banerjee data only goes up to 1999. And what you get is that the consumption, the share of the top 1% was 8% in terms of consumption and 8.5% in terms of income, the Piketty tax-based income. Okay? And you can see that basically even this curves, and you know, it's fantastic reading their paper. They derive all kinds of conclusions from the fact that this came back to 82, and then this is when we were socialistic, and here is when we become capitalistic, so then it goes up. All the basis on the tax data, which has nothing to do with the underlying trend of inequality, which I showed. This is the share of the top 1%. As I said, I showed you that the underlying inequality had stayed broadly constant. So the lesson to be learned from this, beware of the fashions of whatever is popular in the West to apply it to every country in the world, or to every developing country in the world. Even the West, look at Germany, look at Western Europe, look at Scandinavia. All of those countries show a declining trend in inequality. That is, inequality is declining in those countries. Whereas in these three countries, as I mentioned, the English-speaking developed world does show increasing inequality. And I want to show you also that this is not just the case with India. Let's look at China. And this, the red line, is the survey consumption data in China, which shows inequality to be much higher than by this index of the share of top 1% than the inequality as shown by the Piketty data. So of the top 1%, these are the filthy rich guys, but his own survey tax data shows that these guys have a lower share, lower inequality than as shown by the conventional consumption data. So what I'm want to conclude with is that I've used consumption data throughout. I would love to use income data, but income data, income inequality data, household level data does not exist in India. It exists sporadically. The NCAR did a survey in 75, did a survey in 95, and now through ISDS they've done a survey in 2005 and 2011. But basically we don't have a long time series on these data, and there are some other issues with the income distribution data, sample size being one of them, with the other data that are available. But even if you, but the other point is that the consumption data shows that inequality has stayed broadly constant in India, and that consumption data is not much different than the Piketty income data, which purports to show much increasing inequality in India. And that is all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujita. As I was hearing you speak, lots of thoughts came to me, lots of thoughts and some are questions. But I'm going to just share some thoughts, and then maybe there's some questions implied there, but we have questions and thoughts from others too. You talked about the Nehruvian idea of higher education and how it has in some ways damaged India, that we picked up that idea and continued with it. I was one of those people who went to higher education in India when very few people were getting it. In 1958, when I finished school, by God's grace, in the national rankings, I was in the first 10. And so I was told I should do physics honors in Delhi University because it's the most expensive course in the whole country. Expensive means in terms of money that's being put into educate people in physics. I didn't want to do physics, but well, if you can, you should. So I did, and I discovered that there were 10 of the 10 persons who had ranked the 10 highest ranking in the country in the school exams in that year. 7 of them were in my class. So now this was a bad game to play, right? I said, well, if I have to keep showing myself better than others, I should be in another game. So I asked the principal of the college, St. Stephen's, may I switch to economics and give this seat to someone else? And the principal said, "You coward, economics, it's an easy subject compared to physics. Show your guts and you've got to do physics." So I stayed with physics for 5 years. It was tough, believe me. But I know economics is much tougher. I came out of St. Stephen's and decided to join Tata Management Service and not to go to Tata Institute of Fundamental Research or the Atomic Energy Commission, where I never felt that the brightest students would go. So to physics honors in St. Stephen's and upwards. And I joined Tata's. And I arrived in Tata's in the induction period. We had to go to different companies. And unfortunately for me, fortunately for me, my first engagement was in the Department of Economics with Dr. Freddie Mehta, who, well, metaphorically took my pants off. He said, "You are a disgrace to the country. You have wasted the country's resources. Do you know how much it costs to teach a person physics in some large number? And here you are, you want to do management in industry?" He says, and he was a powerful man, he was on the board of, and even then, he said, "I'm going to give you an assignment, and it's in economics, and in 1 month's time, and if you pass, then your induction will be allowed to continue, otherwise watch it. And it is to study the economics of education." It just reminded me, you see, when you're talking. So, my goodness, I said, "How?" He said, "Well, I've got several PhDs in that department. It's not Google days, so you have to I think, take the help of people who knew what they were talking about, not randomly pick things up. And they will help you, and whatever books and things we can get are there. And you will write an essay on the economics of education." And in that process, I was given books to read, and one of them was a book by an economist in the US who said, had been advisor to 2 or 3 presidents of the US on education policy. And the surprising thing, this is what Prof reminded me, he said that Nehru's policy on education was a far-reaching policy connected with the situation of India. I'll tell you what he said. He said there are young people coming out with aspirations for jobs, of course, and education and then jobs. And India didn't have enough jobs. And the best thing to do was to keep them in education. And since you can't afford physics for everybody, open up colleges of arts and so on. He said it's the least costly way to keep young people out of trouble. Hopefully they might get some education too. Expectation, he said, of course, is not to do with education, that's on the other side, that there will be enough employment for these people, enough jobs in industry and so on. And Nehru's probably doing the right thing, so he said. So it's coming back to this thought about connecting things with each other. Now, Sujit has written a book on cricket, and I was reminded, you're like Virendra Sehwag, who just retired. He's going to carry on. He hits a 6 in the first ball. He doesn't wait. So he said at the very beginning, use a phrase I got it, the elitist concept of increasing inequality. And then, when the graph started in 1993-94, there are those who have an ideology, and so on. So I just noted the 6s. And as a Republican publicist has said recently from the Republican Party in the US, it's much harder to catch a grenade, just throw them. So I'm not going to catch them, I'm just throwing my own a bag over here. Perceptions of inequality, you're talking about measures of inequality, there are also perceptions of inequality. And they're linked very much with perceptions of unfairness, which I don't know how one puts a number to or to measure. Reminds me of Tolstoy and Anna Karenina, the opening lines, which are what all happy families are the same in the same way, and all unhappy families are unhappy in their own ways. So equality, everything is the same, but inequality is between 0 and 1 on the Gini. That's where the messy stuff is, where there are feelings of inequality when there should not be any feeling of inequality, perhaps, or perceptions of unfairness in the system. This morning's Times of India, I didn't read what was pointing us to read, was the report of the Mori survey, which says that India is a country in which people are not well informed about what is actually happening as compared to many other countries. And the point they made was that Indians are not well informed about the amount of inequality in their own country. They think there's less. And you are making the opposite point. We think there's a lot of inequality when actually there's much less. So the two views are looking at people's perceptions and that phenomenon of inequality. So you did make, I'm compelled by the evidence that you have presented that income inequality is decreasing. Choosing the quotes that you have chosen between whom and whom. I mean, it's not the 0.01%, it's some percentage of the top 1%. And that education equality is increasing, which is a very compelling argument. And I think, as you pointed out, that obviously more people are getting educated. So you have made, to me, a very strong case that India, for just natural circumstances perhaps, in spite of Nehru, then has been making up on education inequality, and also you're connecting it now with the income inequality that also has not been getting worse, or maybe it has been getting better. So here we are in a situation where some people have perceptions about inequality which may not be satisfied by the numbers that you have given. So I'm going to leave it open now to other people to join the discussion, please. Yes, sir. Could you introduce yourself, your name, and your observation or your question?
I'm K. Mahesh. I'm Special Secretary, National Capital Region in Delhi Government. It was really a treat to listen to Professor Sujit Bhalla. You talked about the rising income with the decline of increasing education. But sir, this is, have you taken into consideration these social groups, the marginalized sections of Indian society, the tribals, the Dalits, the OBC, then the minorities? So do you find differences, inequality amongst them? And secondly, sir, if what you said, if we believe, why is it for the job of a sweeper we have PhDs and matriculates applying for it, lakhs of them? So these are some contradictions. Thank you.
Sujit, would you like to answer them?
Yeah, let me take a couple of more and then I'll answer.
Yeah, my name is G.B. Bagai. If I understood correctly, you said that English-speaking countries like US and Britain, the inequality has gone up, while in Scandinavian countries, inequality has gone down, while in India, it's more or less flat. With increasing education, it's flat or coming down. So, if this is correct, how is it exactly related to education in the three countries? And how does China perform? Because Chinese have done extremely well on primary education, while they are only now going into higher education, while, as you say, the Nehruvian model rewarded higher education unfairly. And of course you have, they're saying that vocational education is the cause why the Chinese have done so much better. So could you please clarify this? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Vensi. I'm a student at Bangalore. Just two questions. One is again connecting to primary education and basic education, because since '92 we shifted from primary education to a basic education system. And does that influence your graphs in a particular way? Second question, you define it as vocational training, but how do you then look at, when you look at rising income and declining, percentages between skill education or skill-based education, which is a kind of vocational, and knowledge-based systems? Is there a differentiation, or is that a reason why the numbers drop, or how do you read that?
So can I just add to that? So you are concerned that in DU and JNU the fees are relatively less.
Little bit less than zero.
Yeah. So, but I have a feeling that in Germany it's also free, and in the state universities in the US, for instance, it's also quite reasonable.
Let me take it. Let me try and answer the questions and go in reverse order. Because that's the closest. One, in Germany, take a developed country. Okay, the purpose of, I think, every society is to redistribute income, and one method of redistributing income is through the education system. So, you go back to 2,000 years ago, the kings, etc., whoever the feudal lords were, they also redistributed income. If they built roads, if they built any infrastructure, you redistribute, because the people who are paying for it are not, if you will, a very large proportion of the people who are benefiting from roads. And defense is another example which I don't want to go into. So if I want to look at what Germany is doing and the state university system, of which I was a beneficiary, if you will, though they had out-of-state students paying a higher fraction, are a tremendous tribute to how it should be done. My only question, which I'll now, through these other questions, try and answer, is we haven't done it the right way. That doesn't mean that when I show that the upper class twits are the only ones getting education, I think they should be charged and the rest of the population should be subsidized. So all I'm saying is, listen, you must subsidize education, especially for the bottom 80%. It's not the bottom 20%, it's not the bottom 30%, it's the bottom 80%. What do? We subsidize it for the top 20%. I mean, you know, my objection is the completely lopsided nature of our policy. So therefore, I'm completely for education and health, massive education and health subsidies for the bottom 70, 80% of the population, but that's not how we do it. Take AIMS, take healthcare, right? So the upper class twits can easily get entry into the AIMS, whether it's who it's meant for. You know, the one thing about India is in the name of the poor. You want to go and murder somebody, go right ahead, as long as you say I'm doing it in the name of the poor. When will we start challenging this attitude in India amongst the elites? So every time I make this presentation, they say, what about the poor? That's all what I'm saying. What about the poor? We don't look at the poor. So, and the poor, I'm taking it as a broad definition, 50, 60, 70%, as far as education and healthcare is concerned. Now, let me take the other. Basically, the analysis does not differentiate by, if you will, skills or not skills, etc. You know, what it does is use, this is a very conventional model, if you do use it, I think you'll get some marginal effect of education, or some marginal effect of skill, but really, it is the years of education, and then you can go into the quality of education, but it's that dominates, so I don't think that makes too much. Then the part of the question I've already answered about the education in the US and in Germany, in these three countries, basically they've reached equality in education. I mean, you know, there's hardly any difference. I mean, the mean years of education is something like 12, an equal proportion of the poor and the rich, if you will, go on to graduate school or go on to college. I mean, everybody goes to college, or 70, 80% does. So they've reached, you know, which is where we should be, we like to be, but the point is that's not relevant for us in India to look at what they have done. In case of China, you know, let's look at Chinese inequality, which doesn't quite fit this model, if you will, on the surface, because Chinese inequality was something a Gini of 0.3 and is now about 0.48, 0.5. What happened was, when you take any socialist country, formerly socialist country, whether it's China, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Cambodia, whether it's Laos, suddenly you find measured income inequality go up. Okay? But after that, it basically stays constant, or if you will, declines. So the education effect, if you will, is just as strong in these economies as it is in India or the others. But they have a step jump, because we measure from 1950 or 1960 onwards. And if you take Russia, right? I mean, these guys, take India, right? 30 years ago, you wanted a telephone, you couldn't get a telephone. You wanted to send your kids to college, you had to get pre-forms or whatever it was. It was a highly unequal country, even though we had a low Gini. Now it is a much more equal country with the same level of Gini, but it is really much more equal than it ever was. So, and I'm not even including in my inequality measure the distortion, if you will, caused by the financing of higher education. Very important point about lacks of people applying for jobs. This is where, you know, in the name of the poor, the reason lacks of people are applying for jobs is they're not following the education income model. You have more education, you have more merit, you get a higher income. They are getting in because the jobs in government pay 5 times what the job in the private sector does. So this is a massive distortion that the government of India continues to do, again in the name of the poor. You know, where are these government people? They are, if you will, take from the lowest clerk, they are, or lowest peon, they are in the 80th percentile. 80th percentile. And we are subsidizing them, we keep increasing their salary. So this is yet another example of where we go famously wrong in the name of the poor. That's why you've got excess. I mean, there's simple, I mean, Subhashish will teach you in Econ 101, not even Econ 101, Econ minus 001, that listen, if you have an incentive, then people respond. So therefore, it is a distortionary government policy, the secular socialist policy of India that has created all these distortions. And it's about time we started questioning it. When I really get charged up, I will talk about the Supreme Court and how it is messing up the country and the Constitution, but I won't go in there right now. Then we have, you know, the good question about the marginalized section, minorities. There was a graph, showed the disprivileged, the privileged. No matter how you do it, the education inequality in India has improved. Whether you look for the Muslims, whether you look for the SCs, whether you look for the STs, etc. And the rate of growth, the poorer you are, the less you had education before, so your rate of growth is higher. And now we are also converging to, if you will, the same level of education amongst across the board. So that's where, if you will, I would say the market system is worth doing. We certainly don't think it's the socialist system of the government of India that has made this possible. It is the market system that has made this possible. Now we come to, you know, a large part, I should have basically started, now I'm coming to your comments, that, which are very relevant, etc. But in the back of one's mind, which one should bring into the forefront of one's mind, is how much ideology affects our thinking, affects our decision making, affects our recommendations, everything else. So the perceptions really have to do with ideology. And the ideology is the government. So I'm taking one ideology. My ideology, I've made quite clear what my ideology is. But the other side's ideology, which are the dominant side, which is controlling the Indian economy and continues to control, is that, you know, basically the poor are getting worse off, the reforms are bad, markets are bad, and the government has to step in, whether it is to fix the price of rice. I mean, we fix the price of rice, for crying out loud, in this country. I mean, where in the world do you have this? You know, this is what upsets me no end. And we go on and on and on. We had the National Food Security Bill 3 years ago. National Food Security Bill in order to have all the rich twits get rice and wheat at 2 to 3 rupees a kilo. I mean, please, please question these things. This is where ideology is. This is not perceptions. This is ideology. You are allowed to have perceptions, but please have some relationship with the perceptions with the facts on the ground, the facts that everybody knows. So I think, you know, it is like, I mean, it's like fooling people all the time, and in India it succeeds.
Just someone in the back, right to the back.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Ramesh. Positive discrimination that we have here in most of the Reservation.
The mic, please.
Sorry, I think it's working now. Ramesh, my name. The positive discrimination, the reservation policy, what has been the role of this in terms of inequality, both education and income in our country? So the role of reservation policy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Take 2 more, daily here, and then
you know, it's one of the issues that comes up in conversations about education is the fact that we are amongst the lowest spenders on public education in the world. We have, I mean, there was in the mid-60s the Kothari Commission which recommended a minimum of 6% of GDP, and to date we haven't crossed 4. And the demand, as you have shown and as we all know, has gone up, you know, exponentially. Obviously, there is a need for much more. And even within the entire amount that is spent, it is actually elementary education that has the largest share. So I'm a little curious to know why you are saying that it is the higher education in some sense that has, is where, which has hogged up all public funds at the expense of, and whether the problem really lies in the fact that the size of the envelope itself is very small, and that's been a bigger problem in terms of the kind of change that we wanted to see. And the reality is, yes, the inequalities, there has been a huge increase in demand, and to that extent education inequality might have gone down. But the fact is that we are still very far away from universalization. The fact is we still have numbers outside the school that are larger than the populations of a lot of countries. And so I'm just wondering, how you, what you have to say about some of those things.
Take one more.
Kunal from Mint. You said that in terms of education inequality decreasing, the quantity matters much more than the quality. But it's because we are starting from a very low base for the quantity for those who had been left out. Now, as that education inequality begins to bridge, do you think at some point this quality will begin to matter, or any data is available from other countries in this regard?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Look, what happens in other countries, first of all, I do not have data on quality, but that wouldn't, you need that to explain earnings rather than to explain the levels of education. What we do know from all of the data on income inequality and consumption inequality in India is, despite the upper UCTs getting very good quality education, that the consumption inequality at least hasn't changed much. So therefore it is swamping, the quantity effect is swamping the quality effect, because otherwise we should be getting increasing to a certain extent inequality. But I don't have the data on that. On quality, it's very, very hard to get it. What we do know, and again from references to China and other countries, the trend I've pointed out on income inequality, etc., is a very pronounced trend across the world, no matter what educational levels the society has. Okay. Now we come to, let me give you some numbers on the education spend in India. The education spend in India is 3.5% of GDP, which is the government spend, but the private spend is something like 2.5% of GDP. Okay, so we are spending 6% of GDP on education. Now let's look deeper into the number. And healthcare is another classic example. We have spending only 1% of GDP on healthcare, so certainly it looks like you're spending very little, but the private sector is spending 5% on healthcare. So we have got a very distorted system. I think the public sector should be more, the private sector should be less. But let me just tell you on education as to what the private sector is doing. Poor people, now these are very poor people. They would rather pay 50 rupees to 100 rupees a month for their kid to go to school in the village than to go to a public school which is right next door where the teachers don't show up. And these very same teachers who don't show up and getting a fat salary, right, will then tutor them in the evenings. This is, this is the mess we've got ourselves into. Let me just finish and I'll be certain to answer any questions you have in this.
No, I just
right?
have a question about your data.
Sorry?
I have a question about your data, because government data on public and private schools shows that the bulk of children in the country are still in public schools. So the private,
absolutely. I didn't
so the
say
percentage spending 50 or 2,000 rupees to go to a private school is statistically still not that significant.
Let me answer. Good question on the data. Look, what I said was, and this is from USSR. Just look at USSR data. This is not my data.
USSR data, please.
I mean,
You are saying that
I'm saying that
you don't believe the USSR data.
Because the USSR, you talk about what sample
Could you introduce
size?
yourself?
It's
Just
not
a
adequate.
minute.
Yeah, it's not an
Yeah.
adequate
Yeah.
or representative sample.
No,
also.
you can introduce
No,
yourself.
I'll answer
Sorry,
the
I'm
question.
Anjali Modi, I'm a journalist.
Okay. So now let's look at what are these data, etc. What you do have for the government data on, and this is everybody, whether you're from the left or the right, has admitted to the possibility and a very large probability of teacher absenteeism. Are you also questioning the data on teacher absenteeism? You're not questioning the data
Yeah,
on
but
teacher
we're
absenteeism.
actually talking about public investment in education, which was the question.
But
that I
public
asked.
investment in education, a very large fraction of it is teachers' salaries.
No, but the point is that public investment in education is very low, and that is what is contributing to the problem in which you are. And it is not because it's not being
Now, wait,
subsidized
let me just
higher
answer.
an elementary education point, which is what you started off.
Let me just, one second. Let me just answer the question of your data.
All right, you
Where do I get the data on the private spending on education? From NSS. Okay? You can just get it from the NSS.
That is
Simple.
the consumption, and you're assuming that what is the consumption is equivalent to what the private school is spending, whereas
No, please, please, please.
Okay,
There were two
let me,
statistics.
let me-
One second. Two statistics that I offered. One is the government spending on education as a percent of GDP. That's 3.5. Correct? Where do we get that data? We get that data from the government.
that's from the amount that the government budget, it's what is
Yeah.
spent, it's not the consumption data. NSS
Is that-
is consumption data.
Please let me finish that. 3.5%, I've explained to you that. Now, from the NSS data, which is the only way you can get it, the household survey, you ask them, how much did you pay for tuition, how much did you pay for books, etc. And that's where the 2.5% comes in. So what's the problem with the data?
One is
3.5 plus 2.5
potential
is
and one
6.
consumption, that's
Okay.
all.
I
Let me,
just want to make an observation about the discussion here, and we will carry on. I was reminded here about Peter Drucker. You know, I was a management consultant and worked in management. And we learned to admire the man, and he's rated to be the world's best management consultant ever, Peter Drucker, and a great social scientist and philosopher also. And Drucker, who used to consult with the CEOs of the largest companies in the 1950s, he founded the profession in that way, used to say, this is something I've debated with Narayan Murthy, who always says, I tell people, bring me the facts. Only God can bring me his opinion, right? And Drucker used to say, when I go to a powerful CEO, I first ask him, what's your opinion? Because any smart person can find the facts to suit his opinion, right? So sometimes it's wise to ask, are you leftist or rightist? And then we know what facts. You can get their facts and facts and facts. Right? So I think we have views, we have opinions, we have ideologies, and they will come into the discussion. They will come into the discussion. And that's okay. That's okay. Okay? So
yeah,
let
I
me
had to
just
answer
get
the
off this
question.
one. Let's go to the other
Yeah,
question.
no, there was a question I wanted to answer on positive discrimination and reservation.
Yeah. Sorry.
I think is a very important one. And you know, the story is the same. And you know, I've likened, or at least I liken Indian economic policy making and Indian facts to the peeling of an onion. You take off one layer and you cry, and you take off another layer and you cry some more, and you take off another layer and you cry some more. Now, directly on this positive discrimination and reservations, starting in 1991, we had the Mandal Commission and then the OBCs, who constitute about 35% of the population, as getting major benefits. Now, the same NSS data, if you will, which is the only basis we have for making any individual comparisons, turns out that the OBCs is the average Indian. So what we have reservations, if you will, positive discrimination. I call it negative discrimination because it's against the poor. The positive discrimination here means we subsidize heavily the average Indian. That is where your money is going. So therefore, when you look at the reservation system, it may have been a good idea, and I emphasize the may part and underline it. It may have been. But clearly, and I would love to get anybody's reaction, what sense and which country subsidizes the average, and by average I mean the average in terms of the 40th to the 60th percentile, not in terms of the upper end. Where in the world do you spend a major amount of money and resources in order to help the average guy? So I'm leaving that question to anybody who has any evidence of any country in the world where the guys who's already well off, you now bring in a reservations policy for the guys who are very well off.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Would you come and use the mic here? And just mention your name.
I'm Sanjay Yadav, I'm a writer. And contributing to inequality are the white elephants like the IITs, IIMs. The only thing they produce are people with swollen heads who expect even more swollen, inflated salaries. And, you know, these undermine the competitiveness, competitive advantage of India. So that's, but unfortunately the government is going along the same track, producing more IITs, more IIMs. I think we ought to abolish them, really. So they were first established in the late 50s, 60s, and yet the Indian economy, despite these so-called people of merit, remained in the doldrums till the 90s. So I think that they have to be abolished. And then medical education, which is an artificial scarcity, because it's so regulated, the country needs millions of doctors, but it's an artificial scarcity where the only object is to maintain the status and income of the doctors. And they've also spawned a vast industry of coaching centers and dysfunctional invigilation, surveillance of the examination system. But where I disagree with you, sir, is about the reservations. They didn't start in 1991, they started in 47.
No, I know. This was the OBCs.
No, not just OBCs, I mean 47, where eligibility criterion is reserved for Indians. I mean, every country will reserve for its people. It's really what you call it representation. France, you'll have French people, Japan, you'll have Japanese, US, you'll have Americans. Every country will have to protect its people. Unfortunately, India is a diverse country, and every section of the society wants a share of the wealth. It's just a reality, you can't run away from it. And if you do away with reservations, do away with the criterion of Indian nationality as an eligibility, you hire from the whole world.
No,
So that's my answer to your last point.
okay.
Any more? Yes.
My name is Shiv Nadar, and I did go to IIT and Delhi University. And while I agree with this gentleman that there are far more IITs and IIMs than they were when I was in college, one thing that does bother me, sir, and thank you for your presentation, is the high cutoff rate, the very high cutoff rate, to the point that it was published in the Times of India last year, 95%, 98%. Students are killing themselves trying to reach that percentage rate. And when they fail, they end up committing suicide because they can't make it up to the top 1 percentile. The question I have, sir, is what factor does that play in inequality? That you've got a big workforce between 59 and 24 who have the skills but cannot make to that cutoff rate. How do you explain that?
You got something to add?
Yes, sir, I just want to add one, it's a comment, sir. Like, this is a, well, should we have more IITs, should we have more institutions of excellence in medical and engineering, and should we have more public expenditure? I feel that yes, we must, but how these institutions are generating wealth. Now here the question of research is very important. Now these IITs and IIMs, they're not great research centers. And if you want to have a knowledge-based economy, and if you have IITs who are really great research centers, and they really have good research, they can get patents. With patents, you generate more wealth, and that can be distributed for other public expenditure. So one should not be against institutions in engineering and medical that in public investment should be restricted. I am for it, but with a lot of research, which should be one of the purposes, which is not the case with IIT. If you look at the ranking of IIT in the world, we all know it's 235. It's not great. So is the case with the IIMs. They're not that they're ranked some of the best in the world. And research is one criteria that they lack a lot. And if they do good research and have patents that can generate wealth and that can be spent for other public expenditure.
So Ashish, you want to comment on this one, you say?
Yeah, just one quick point, going back to what Arun's parents and teachers told him to do, right? I think that continues even today. And the thing that bothers me is, as we are becoming more and more educated, which is true, right? Somehow that pressure of what children should be doing That pressure continues. And the market continues to show, you go through an engineering degree just to get a 2 lakh, 2.5 lakh salary, starting salary. Whereas if you probably do an English honors, you should be able to get more, right?
Right.
because that's what the market demands, right? There's a glut of engineers, right? And they're not very well trained either. So why is that happening? Why is, he talked about knowledge base. Why are parents not having this knowledge base?
Okay. Look, can we, this helps to answer part of the questions. I'm not going to, and I don't think I have the answers for the whole system, but let's think of a utopian world where any student who wants to go to college and study English or engineering, not forced to study physics, etc., gets a subsidy from the government. And I would say, including the upper class sectors, right? Gets a subsidy. And that student can choose to go to Shiv Nadar University, can choose to go to Delhi University, can choose to go to Hansraj College, can choose to go to whatever college, etc. Are we willing, and shouldn't we be willing, to have that system? What I'm trying to say is what the system needs, and the same thing applies to the government. You want checks and balances, you want incentives. There are no checks and balances on the government to perform its duties, as well as any teacher in the government, whether in the university or IITs or anywhere else, where there is a lot of checks and balances on these people. Not everybody, that's why somebody asked about 4 lakh students, 4 lakh people, including some PhDs, asking for a peon job in UP. Why, when we see it, why don't we see why that is happening? There's a massive distortion. There's a massive distortion in the salaries that the public sector gives, and there's a massive distortion in the privileges on the education side that the public sector has, in terms of not showing up for work, never being fired, or whatever. So the one way out of it is to bring competition in. That I have to respond to incentives. The teacher has to respond to incentives. And the teacher has to perform, just like the student has to perform. Then you will, and you're absolutely right on the engineering. If you get out of the IITs, etc., and I'll answer one question on the IITs in a minute. It is terrible. Now let's take the IITs. You're saying there's a lot of competition for, these people have to get a 96% cut-off rate, etc. Well, in IIT Delhi or in any IIT, the SC/STs, that's 27%, and there's another 23% of OBCs, they need to get only 40% of the lowest mark that somebody has who's been admitted not in the quota system. So you're not really doing anybody any favors. So if you think of students being upset, committing suicides, whatever it is, that they have been put in, they have a lot of aspirations, as they should. They're not well prepared. They're not well prepared because of our elitist, partly because of our elitist education system. And then you say, okay, we've got to educate them, and we've got to give them privileged seats in the universities, and they're not very qualified in order to get those. They are, if you will, 20-30% who are extremely well qualified. But 70% of your students are not well qualified at all. So you've got this mess. And we want to do it because, we want to help the poor. Wherever I go, whatever I say, etc., we've got to help the poor. I said, hey, you're not helping the poor. So this is, our system is completely screwed up. As I said, it's like an onion. You cry. You literally cry studying the Indian economy, as you've done, as I've done, as anybody who's done seriously studied without ideology, the Indian economy. So, you want artificial scarcity. The Indian government, thy name is artificial scarcity. And by Indian government, I'm including the IITs and all the rest of it. We create this mess up. We have been saved because of the fact that any amount of education does help. Okay? And as I said, the students, notwithstanding the
data questions. Basically, there's a lot of increasing delta. You know, people always in India tend to get highly confused between the change and the level. And I think the most important thing in studying development, by definition, it's a tautology, is to look at change, not to look at levels.
Can we take one more round of questions? Gentleman in the back, and then
Hi, my name is Shiv Nadar. I'm a doctor. I'm wondering whether your problem is one of measuring variables endogenous to a system. So, for example, you mentioned health. The increase in life expectancy from independence to, say, 2011 has been, we're now up to about 68. And we spend about $15 to $20 a year in comparison to the US, whose life expectancy is about 75, only 7 years more, and spends 400 times as much. My question is that if you apply that sort of analysis to education, what is that independent variable, this life expectancy, if you will, that's perhaps that's outside the economy, that's also that controls education? Thanks.
you said one, and okay, two more, and then.
You mentioned constructed vacuum and artificial scarcity, but then I'd like to come back to, when we look at, like you said, can we look the efficacy of the teaching and the system. But then when you look back to 92, when we signed the GATT agreement, the WTO, that's when we had a shift from primary education to basic education. That's when we had one teacher doing 5 classes, So how much of the scarcity, this vacuum, is constructed either by the government or by a commercial vested interest? Especially in terms of, within the skill and knowledge-based system.
Yeah, thank you very much. Although I was late, but I managed to catch up with some. One of the important issues with respect to the inequality in education, and for which India has made some considerable progress, is the gender issue. The number of girl children who are now in the education system has vastly increased, and as per the government report for the Millennium Development Goals, they said we have achieved parity. And now with the Sustainable Development Goals, we of course have to go a long way. And as you mentioned rightly, the quality of education is always a very big question mark. But then this trend about increasingly more and more girl children, women being in the education has helped the country a lot. And how this trend can be further strengthened looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. Though India has the largest number of literates, it also has the largest number of graduates. Of course, these are not employable. That's another issue. But about the girl children and that inclusivity aspect seems also a very dominant issue when we are discussing education and our developmental agenda. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm A.K. Merchant, working in the field of education and also serving the Baha'i community.
I'll go in the order of the questions about measuring variance endogenous to the system, and that the US spends 400 times as much as India in terms of healthcare. Well, I'm not a doctor, but I am an economist, and it turns out that if you look at once you reach the age of about 20 or 25, your life expectancy, no matter where you are in the world, is equal to that of the US. The point being that basically a lot of the differences in life expectancy that you see are between the ages of 0 and 5, and perhaps a little bit till 10. So therefore, what we want to look at, and so what has helped India's life expectancy go up, is not the spending by the government, if you will. It is technology. Technology around the world, which we then get, the drugs, etc., at a lower level, and we can even improve it radically by, if you will, having an efficient for the poor system, or for the bottom half, I don't want to use the term poor, for the bottom half of the population, a system which delivers services to them, which we systematically fail to be doing as efficiently as we could do. Nevertheless, the delta, again, in this area has been quite considerable. So they have more access, they have more access to drugs, they have more access to medicines, and a lot of it is affordable because of our policies, if you will, on these manufacturing these drugs at a low cost. The scarcity business of skill and knowledge, I'm not that persuaded, but I also don't know that much about the difference in basic and primary. So I look at it, but every society has different people with different aspirations, different skills. Some want to become physicists, some want to become politicians, some want to become doctors, and we should encourage, and some want to become English literature majors, and we should encourage people by financing. Again, I keep coming back to what the hell is the government collecting taxes for if it is not for social services, if it is not for public goods in the classic sense? Unfortunately, in India, public goods are public bads, and private goods are now public. Senior, you know what I'm trying to get at. So something to the other. Last but not least, I think there is a genuine revolution, and I'm using the term advisedly. There's a genuine revolution happening in India, happening around the world, and it is in India more so because other developed countries have already gone down this path. But really, in terms of roles of men and women that they play, whether it's in the household, whether it's in the job place, and everywhere around, this is a brave new world. And this is, and that's why I said part of it was that we haven't even seen the equalizing effect of female education, because once they enter the labor force, which they will. Previously, they did enter the labor force because they weren't educated, they couldn't get the jobs or whatever that they wanted. Now there's a drive-out effect that they would want to go ahead and work. So I think that is where we stand to benefit one of the most, because we are one of the lowest labor force participation rates. Plus, as I said, the social revolution, and I've looked at the performance levels by various indicators of exams, etc. And whether it is Korea, whether it is China, whether it is India, we see it in Delhi, right? I mean, or at least one sees that in the newspaper as to how the top students are women. And 20 years ago, there wasn't anything. So I think, no, this is a big change. This is fantastic. This is a brave new world.
Thank you, Sujit. Thank you. They say that a great education is one that doesn't give you all the answers. It leaves you with deeper questions. It brings deeper questions to your mind. And in my mind, certainly, you're leaving me with more questions, deeper questions to explore than I came in with here. You did say, in the course of your presentation or later, that in the early 50s, in 1950s and 60s, India had a low Gini coefficient, but was a highly unequal country, and that now India has a high Gini coefficient, but is, to your mind, a much more equal country. So there's a question about what does the Gini coefficient measure, and not the real equality or inequality that you feel we should be looking at. And that comes to then perceptions about what I believe is most important as a dimension of inequality or equality, and what someone else believes is more important. Affirmative action. We are right now in Paris, world, talking about climate change. And I think the point being made is that here on out, you want to treat everyone equally, or there's some history that must be taken into account. There's a sense of fairness or unfairness. So again, in affirmative action, it is here on out, you can't make us equal to the rest. You owe us something. You as a society do so. To education, and these many questions about the type of education that society is pushing to get created in the private sector, including management schools or engineering schools, and parents are pushing their children to get. And so Ashish, you made a good point. It's about the education of parents and the society as a whole. And so when we're shaping policy, public policy, it is something that is public policy. So it is people's views, their needs, and their perceptions must be brought together to say, well, what is the right policy for which is fair to all of us together. And in that, I think the education that we perhaps need most of all is an education to listen to another point of view. Just to listen deeply to another point of view. Why is this person saying this? And there must be some good reason for a good human being to hold that point of view, and what's the history of this person that brings the person to say that. I think we have to educate ourselves in democracy in India. And democracy is not about running elections with electronic devices. It is really about listening to each other and being able to shape views of what we must do all together. And education itself on the subjects, as you could see, is one in which we are very distorted and divided on what we believe would be a good policy for education. So Shiv Nadar University, I congratulate you and thank you for asking me to be with Sujit and these people who have really had a very lively discussion and left me at least with more questions about education. And it's not the education in the university, it's the role you're playing in stimulating education outside in society, which is the title of the course. So thank you, and thank you everybody.